Hello, my name is Angelyn Spignesi, Arden. I am a depth psychologist and professor of humanities at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut. It's 40 years, this year actually, 40 years that I've been exploring the figures and landscapes of the unconscious. Now I see that in terms of the acceptance of the reality of the unconscious, the climate is changing. 3 weeks ago, I heard Bishop Barron's podcast on Jordan Peterson, who I'd not heard of. And there was Jung and the Bible and the work of the latter, and he has over 1 million followers. So I see that the climate is changing, and there's the possibility of an acceptance of a connection between depth psychology and our Christian tradition. The figures and landscapes of the unconscious are not contrary to tradition, quite the opposite. Yet it took me years and years to work this out, which is what I'll be relaying on these YouTube videos. I began 40 years ago with the question, since the unconscious works within and through the body, would not the female body register it differently? Experience and know it differently, not better or worse, but differently than a man. So I asked, what can I, a woman, uncover from both the depths and the heights of the unconscious, in full view of and respect for the body and interpersonal relations? My first 2 books were published in 1983 and 1990 by prominent Jungian presses, and then I brought my work to Christianity in the 3rd book. Now, during which time, fortunately, I had met and married my husband, Ken. This is now 2001, 2002, and Jungians at that time, for the most part, were not Christians. So the Jungian press said that they would publish that 3rd book, but since the audience would be small, I would have to pay them thousands of dollars. I should say that I have found a similar version for depth psychology in Christian circles, so I decided to continue the work alone, privately, and self-published the next 7 books, from then until 2015. This suited me, since I'm an introverted depth psychologist, a writer who loves philosophy and theology, and very far from being a marketer. And the depth in which I work necessitates a certain silence, a hermetic sealing of sorts. Also, since 1978, I've been developing, or I should say finding, a lyrical analytic language, which is how the ideas and insights come to me in this work. So given the possibility of an interest in depth psychology and a rapprochement between it and the Christian tradition, I've decided to share my work here, which is quite a stretch for me. So I'll be reading from the books as well as sharing my thoughts about them. A little of my history. I received my doctorate in 1977 in cognitive scientific psychology. Through many events at that point, I discovered the limits of rational thought. So I returned then to a study of Freud's psychoanalysis and began reading Jung. Now, psychoanalysis had been with me for a long while in my life, since 1953, when my allergy doctor gave my mother books on Freud to read when he saw the eczema covering my body. He was Jewish and had immigrated to America during World War II, and before he left Vienna as a medical student, he had brought cigars to this man Freud. So he took one look at me and asked my mother about conditions in the family that I might be carrying on my skin. Now, this was in 1953. Dr. Kessler was a very fine and unusually psychological medical doctor who worked with me for many years. I found the books he had given my mother in the closet when I was in high school, and they led me to read Freud's interpretation of dreams, since I always had vivid dreams. And the grandmother after whom I'm named, an immigrant from Italy, used to read the dreams of her community. And I read the dreams of my college friends. But then, in the 1970s, the psychology respected in academia was primarily scientific and behavioristically oriented. But actually, I'm grateful for that training and in developing my thinking and certain ways of using my mind. But as I said, life events showed me the limits of logic, reason, and the conscious will, which influenced me to add the study of phenomenology to my scientific dissertation, and also to return to psychoanalysis and begin delving into Jung's work in a postdoctoral year. The following year, in 1978, I got a job at the University of Dallas as an assistant professor in a program offering a PhD in depth psychology and phenomenology. I brought into that program the scientific approach, but also moved into my true vocation, in-depth psychology. There I trained with Dr. James Hillman, who previously had been director of studies at the Jung Institute in Zurich and was the founder of archetypal psychology. I was his colleague, analyst, and friend of his and his family. I wrote Starving Woman, A Psychology of Anorexia Nervosa from 1980 to 1982. I returned to Connecticut in 1981 when my colleagues had to leave the university, and I had concerns then about boundaries and relativism. Then I had a practice that lasted almost 30 years with an emphasis on dream work. I wrote my second book, Lyrical-Analysis, The Unconscious through Jane Eyre, from 1982 to 1989, and it was published in 1990. I will start with that work. Now, I also will put my first book on here at a later date. I briefly will review that first book now, though, since it directly led me to the second one. When I began writing it in 1980, bulimia had not even been named. I was teaching Aristotle's De Anima, his work on the soul, in my History of Psychology course at the University of Dallas. After class, a young woman came to my office saying that her soul hurt, and she was throwing up her food on purpose after binging. She said other female students were doing the same. Now, I was familiar with anorexia, but had not heard of this aspect. So I went to a nearby medical school and did research in their library. I found articles on anorexia that went back 100 years, so that would be 140 years now. And they were full of meticulous observations. They noted the binge vomit aspect, and they covered a plethora of treatments. This research confirmed my sense that a mother-daughter symbiosis is at the core of the syndrome. I framed my study in the oppositionalism, the polarization of mother and father in our culture, which is even more prevalent now. If mother and father are not in a mutually satisfying and fruitful relationship, then mother often forms a symbiotic tie, a fusion, with one of like body, her daughter, which is not healthy and often goes back generations. The daughter lives out the mother's often unconscious lack of fulfillment. She's carrying the tyrant in that, mother's bitter and lonely bite, which encourages the daughter to starve, while at the same time is her defense against it. That pattern led me to the ancient Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone. Persephone must travel to the underworld shades of Hades and back to Demetrian earth. I read the syndrome in terms of the constellation of the figures of mother, daughter, Hades. Now, I use figure here in the sense of Jungian archetypal psychology to indicate the people of the unconscious, the people who are the primary way the unconscious manifests in our dreams. In later work, I explored the relation of these quote-unquote people to metaphysics and theology, and that was published in 2015. But back to this book, this first book. Through the symbiosis with her daughter, the mother implicitly communicates aspects of her unconscious pertaining to her thwarted or culturally repressed ambition or desires, including rage. These aspects have been imaged in the literature of a century, as well as my own patients, as an inner tyrant, forcing her to starve. The daughter is therefore dominated by the effects of the mother's unconscious, and then lives them out literally by becoming their embodiment. Mother and daughter both are sending a message from the unconscious over female generations, not to locate need and appetite in physical satiation only, but to locate a desire articulating images of the unconscious, not before spoken. So the starvation is an attempt to articulate the unconscious of generations as it prevents such a delivery, since it remains literal, only embodied to starving or binging to death. Now, while writing that book, I had to get a small benign tumor under my right eye removed. This was in 1980, and one stayed overnight then in the hospital for that kind of surgery. And being an avid reader, I brought along a pleasure book. Now, I had never read Jane Eyre, and I started reading it, and I saw in the first chapter a symbiosis between a mother figure and daughter figure, with a tyrant cousin favored by the mother bullying the daughter. This is the next book I have to do, I thought. So from 1982 to 89, I carefully read the first 13 chapters, which is a bit more than a quarter of the novel, as dreams. I considered it a modern fairy tale, finally written by a woman, and delivering gems on the female psyche that have spoken to us consistently since it was published in 1847. Bronte explored aspects of the personality and psychopathology that were not named until the next century. Here is a book written in many cultures for generations. According to Wikipedia at en.wikipedia.org/wiki/adaptations_of_Jane_Eyre, there have been 8 silent films, 15 feature films, one as recent as 2011, 13 radio versions, one as recent as 2016, 14 TV versions, one recently in 2006, and 12 theater versions, with a few in the 21st century. So I spent 7 years working in great detail psychologically analyzing the figures and landscapes of this novel. Now, over that time, the language in which I was writing changed. It became no longer one of discursive syntax, that is subject, verb, object, but a lyrical analysis. Okay, so when one analyzes something, one is in the position of interpreting the relation and meaning of the images from the outside. But lyrical writing comes from extended meditations and associations of body image to the images. Or that I should say body experience, as one is with the images. I saw that the challenge was not to supplement one mode with another, yet allowing one to become the other in an oscillating way, even as that meant disturbing the discursive. So this work is not an interpretive theory which employs the lyrical reflection and considers the lyrical subsidiary or secondary to meaning, but it's one that includes and moves from one to the other without the reduction or denigration of either, yet in a way that both are beneficial for the other in arriving at meaning. As I wrote in the introduction, page 15, quote, "Analysis loosens, takes apart whole into parts, and asks about the significance of the parts, to themselves, to one another, to the larger text. Breaking up analysis lowers, decenters, and language must be changed if analysis succeeds. One has the choice at that point to write the language as it breaks down, or to translate it to a more familiar language, which is discursive. When I did not translate, I found that where the unconscious pushed logical aspects of conceptualization to their limit, the lyrical style emerged. The lyric then deepened the analysis further, eventually overreaching that limit and becoming lyrical again, etc. So the style is at once lyrical and analytic, and where the lyrical exceeded the analytical, the section is set off on the page, and where the analytical exceeds the lyrical, the introduction and afterward sections emerged." End of quote. Basically then, with much silence, attention, and concentration for years, I worked in a deep place where analysis and lyric, left and right, transformed one another, and a new language evolved with new understanding, new meaning. So I continued writing in this language and getting insights and understanding from it all in my books for 40 years now. Once the analysis broke down to the lyric, to the entrance to subconscious experience, it was a place of uncertainty and mystery, and I think a certain amount of faith carried me through for sure. That faith would grow and become more and more necessary as future books emerged. So in Lyrical-Analysis, the unconscious through Jane Eyre, as I proceed with interpreting each chapter, at times I set off a poetic section which deepens the meaning through human experience and reflection on the images as lived. Jane Eyre is about the encounter of a female with archetypal male figures and surviving, even thriving from such, to becoming a person of integrity. I found that these and other figures, as well as the major landscapes of Gateshead, Lowood, and Thornfield, metaphorically follow female anatomy. Each indicates a portion of female anatomy, describing that particular space and also who one is when one lives in it, and how it manifests according through whom others see ourselves to be. From the introduction, page 23, quote, "Therefore, Bronte conceived of female development not in terms of linear progression, but as an uncovering of the unconscious related to body in a passage, in parentheses, the ear, E-Y-R-E, circulating up and down that body. She was close enough to the unconscious to register what we only have been discovering this century, that the unconscious does not follow deterministic laws of the physical sciences, nor can it be translated into those laws. Its movement is spiral. It repeats and echoes. Its speech is ambiguous and fluid, its figures heterogeneous and very much interactive with the landscapes in which they appear." The heroine of Bronte's novel never would have reached Thornfield or been hired by it if that mansion did not have the crimson drawing room mirroring that from which Gateshead started. Each landscape is included in the next, which draws from it in further delineation of its properties. Progression through regression is the movement of the passages here." End quote. So I'm claiming that the first 13 chapters of the novel is Bronte analyzing her own unconscious. That is, the first 13 chapters of Jane Eyre. She's very close to what actually happened in her own life and is analyzing her own unconscious. But from chapter 13 on in Jane Eyre, Jane develops the erotic relationship through courtship with Rochester, and this is something Bronte never passed through in life with any erotic male person. So my own study of the workings of the unconscious in a woman leaves off at the 13th chapter of Jane Eyre and then ends with my rewriting of the continuation and end of the novel. Okay, so now to chapter 1. I begin with each of the 13 chapters with a synopsis of Bronte's chapter. So I'll start with a synopsis of Bronte's chapter 1, and then I go to my lyrical analysis of that, the chapter, read as a dream. So here is chapter 1, which I have titled Window Seat. And whenever I take something from the novel Jane Eyre, I will say here, quote, unquote. Okay, so here is my synopsis of the first chapter of Jane Eyre. There is no walk this day of wintry wind and slashing wetness. The child is relieved. She is not large enough to keep up with the larger cousins, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. She hangs behind on the walk from which today she is grateful not to be returning, with nipped fingers and a heart darted by chidings of the nursemaid, returning to the mother that Mrs. Reed, drawing up by the fire beside her 3 children. The sofa is not for this smaller cousin. Mrs. Reed has ordered her to keep a distance until she becomes more the natural child, the sofa welcoming only young ones contented. Jane, this mother says to her, you have not an attractive manner, not sociable. Until you become of a lighter disposition, Jane, you are not of us. The child wants to know what it is she has done. The aunt scolds the question, demanding a distance. Jane withdraws into a room adjacent. She is crawling into the window seat, drawing the scarlet draperies on her right, as there on the left the clouds bearing down their ceaseless rain, protected by the window pane, yet not separated from those November elements. She opens the book of birds today drawn to the seafowl of a haunted terrain of the Arctic zone. From these pages, a lone rock upon billowing sea, broken boat on desolate coast, quote, cold and ghastly moon glancing through bars of cloud at a wreck just sinking, end quote. Solitary churchyard with headstone, she sees as haunted. Two ships becalmed, she sees as marine phantoms. There is a fiend and thief, she passes in terror. And then the black, quote, black-horned thing seated aloof on a rock, surveying a distant crowd surrounding a gallows, end quote. In her own way, she is happy with these images, evoking stories vivid and mysterious as those of the nursemaid Bessie, who, while ironing and in pleasant mood, would tell the ballads, the old fairy tales. She is happy until that occurs the most feared. The interruption, a voice, Madame Mope, the cousin John is calling. Weak in vision and conception, he cannot find her, yet the sister Eliza points out the window seat, and then leaves as the brother enters, fully stout, ordering subservience. He wears a dingy skin, thick lineaments and limbs, 14 and only 4 years older, yet so fully larger. Quote, he gorged himself habitually at table, which made him bilious and gave him a dim and bleared eye and flabby cheeks, end quote. Heavy limbs not holding much affection for the mother who indulges him, or sisters. Yet Jane he hates. His physical blows to her arrive many times a day. These attacks for which there is no appeal. The servants do not stand up to this young master, and as for the mother, even when they occur in front of her, she never sees the blows. Quote, habitually obedient, end quote. Jane follows his command to stand before him, whereupon repetitiously his tongue thrusts in and out. Terrified of the blow forthcoming, her body withering, yet not avoiding a look upon him of disgust, he sneers. This is for your impotence with Mama, he strikes her, for hiding behind the curtain, for the look in your eye like that of a rat. As she totters, he is demanding to know her exercise behind scarlet drapery. A book. He wants to see the book, and as he grabs it, he calls her dependent. How dare she rummage in his bookshelves, for they are his, and it will be his home soon. Stand by the door. He is telling her to stand out of the way of any glass. She is clear-sighted, but she cannot see his intent. The book hurled through the air hits her, and with a cry she falls, her head striking against the door cuts. The blood bursts forth with its sharp pain. She calls him slave driver, Roman emperor. Quote, I really saw in him a tyrant, a murderer, end quote. He lunges at her, grasping what is a desperate thing now, a frantic, flailing one. Bellowing, he says, rat, rat. Cousins running to the brother's aid, calling mother. Girl, child, flying in a fury at a young master. Mother orders this, quote, picture of passion, end quote, locked up in the red room. So now I will begin my lyrical analysis of that chapter. Raw coldness and bleakness desolation of a motherless child sees the mothering of other children. Sofa maternal warmth available only to others. She is not the natural child, inferior, awkward, she cannot keep up, lags behind, The hands get nipped, frostbitten fingers clutched. She is chided. She retreats. This the depressed child, isolated, cut off, out in the cold, on the window edge of outer and inner, in between, marginal, forlorn child. Somber, solemn, and tender, she crawls into the imagination. Sharp edge of rock surrounded by billowing waves. Nothing holds her here. The vessels are broken and sinking. She goes into the depths of the dead at the churchyard, finding then a fiend and thief and gallows witnessed by a aloof, quote, black-horned thing, end quote. Promontory and dangerous descents, with no containment. This landscape is cragged, icy, desolate. What life there is appears black, phantom-like, demonic. Here is the rejected child, residing within reflections of isolation, offer the solace. It is a frozen landscape, Lapland, Iceland, Arctic, fast, black space of whiteness. Isolation absolute of no sound, without color, touch nothing. The silence abrasive, jagged rock edge, sprouting only the dead twig, broken descent. No voice, no help, no comfort. There is no mother here. Now there's no mother, but a rejecting stepmother when the child is unnatural, preternatural, not sociable, does not fit into the society, yet is marginal, of inferior other worlds, from worlds of otherness, heterogeneous. How the child lags behind is not the natural child, is that attempt at an alterity the mother rejects. The gallows, fiend, and thief, sinking and phantom vessels are as responsible for the stepmother's distance and scolding, as does that distance send the child to those gallows. Mrs. Reed fears the place of this window seat child, as this place reflects her own petrification. Window seat child sits between scarlet drapery and winter storm. The elements bear down upon her. She is on the edge between exterior and interior worlds. The child sits where exterior becomes interior. That is the window seat understanding, where she is not separate from any elements. No difference between herself and any beating element, undifferentiated within stepmother's recess, symbiosis. Undifferentiated from stepmother is not that the child is identical with stepmother or identifies, yet stands within and thereby for stepmother's unconscious, which makes child appear alien, non-adaptive to what is conscious, and therefore revolting. This alterity into which stepmother pushes child back, binding to the realms rejected. Child retreats when stepmother orders it. Stepmother's demand for distance becomes child's frozen retreat behind some scarlet covering. Rejected, the child sits in the stepmother's order, which is an Iceland recess covered by scarlet. Symbiosis. Within stepmother's demand is child's desire for the unnatural, placing her in a recess undifferentiated from the death forces. Mother rejects, yet holds child within. This rejection binds child to mother's unconscious as a failed attempt at separation, keeps the child recessed, repressed in the very unnatural, non-social place that the mother shuns. The ice realm is not displacement of a desire for a sofa mother, yet is unconscious desire of mother to be thrown back to the origins, rejecting child, throwing back child to the sources of other consciousness, unconscious desire. The ice realm is also child's desire to reside in the unconscious of mother, which is the window seat recess of the sofa mother. Cold rejection of the stepmother. What looks like space between mother and child is actually child's retreat into the recess of mother's most feared unnatural desire, frozen, becoming criminal. Antipathetic symbiosis. The child's retreat into the recess of mother's criminal desire keeps that child upon some undifferentiated edge of no movement between interior and exterior. Still window seat with no parent of a human comfort or guide buffering. Instead, a stepmother's face, now ghastly moon and wreck. Elements slashing outside, also the scolding inside. The child sits protected, yet not separate from both, in the window seat, containing the forces of a turning mother. As ghosts in realm of death, no pulse here of feeling, the child sits suspended, breath held unmoved, undifferentiated space of a window seat without movement. Nothing moves the child here, psyche in a vacuum, when the child is most undifferentiated, not separate. She is protected by a vacuum. Schizoid protection, when non-differentiated, becomes vacuum suspension. The schizoid retreat, window seat moment, when inner is all one wants of the outer, out of relationship, out of touch, all devitalized. We're churchyard of grave, the sea its phantom, the black one is aloof and horned. Out of a window seat comes a text, images and verbal accounts of those marginal regions. And her place within stepmother's rejection is to examine their delineation, configuration. The universe of the window seat, its death-white realms, is demarcated by the child, yet never solidified through signification. Nor does the child ever herself become solidified while demarcating that universe. What could have been mother has reverted to threshold of a death realm whose objects are non-objects, cracked, aloof, sinking, fading, decomposing, and they do not require, even preclude positing Jane as an initiating human being. More deject, with no object, desire for non-object, longing for permanent residence in a place of no object and no subject, no being. For Jane is happy in her window seat, and the temptation here is complacency in a place of demons. We have been humanly alienated to a degree we're suspended between interior and exterior. We are secure with the demons, keeping us in the mother's circle without touch. Frozen place of intimacy, it comes with a complacency and haunted retreat. This is the window seat temptation. We avoid this Jane, child, inferior, and rejected. We despise this face reflecting gallows and granite edge. We run from Jane at her window seat. We run to be the more natural child on Mama's sofa. We are shunning the other cousin. She is not to know fireside chatter beside a mothering protective. More, this awkward one lagging behind becomes content in her Iceland retreat. Quote, I was then happy at least in my way, end quote. She wants no interruption, and this is when she is called by the bilious son of the stepmother. With the demon, she is dropped to the depths, isolation on the window seat, and here she becomes addressed by John Reed. He's been looking all over for her. He is not discerning. He gets the overview, but he is tenacious in his searching. He wants to find her. His voice comes to us choking and with a malicious sneer, Madam Mope. It comes to us snide and cruel. It comes to us, catches us in its hate for all we are. It is a voice without a call. Jane is called. John Reed's interruption is part of her calling. Madam Mope, John Reed mocking her retreat, which draws her out. John Reed comes out of her landscape with its fiend and horned thing, himself as tyrant murderer. She is sitting in a psychic vacuum, inner as outer, undifferentiated from mother, recess attracting fiend and thief. In the vacuum of the window seat is also the beating rain from which she is protected, yet not separate. Vacuum and invasion mutually attract. Within the order by the stepmother to vacuum recess is the drop to the ice edge rock bottom completely alone as she is assaulted by the demonic son. What Mrs. Reed had punished was Jane's question back, later termed impudence. What did I do? Jane's question posits her as a differentiated person in Mrs. Reed's presence, requiring interlocution. Her question is her presumption that she is separate enough to be Mrs. Reed's interlocutor, even as she resides within that woman's rejection and inferiority. It presumes that the child can dialogue from another viewpoint with whom has alterity, and the stepmother returns, no, she cannot. The push back in by the stepmother is the stepmother's turn away, binding them. Asking Mrs. Reed the question about what she has done to deserve the punishment indicates that when snapped at, Jane does not easily capitulate, returns instead some spark. And it is this spark the stepmother would extinguish, cannot meet, once away, removed, not entirely, yet on the window seat periphery, scarlet curtain. And it is to this that her explosive son attaches. Mrs. Reed's punishment of Jane's impotence is also how the stepmother is blind to John's attack. John attaches to a scarlet curtain side of which Jane already is a part. Jane has her own red, but it has become humanly alienated and even demonic, attached the demon Reed in the face of stepmother who cannot face it. The scarlet curtain side of Jane to which the son attaches, through which he sees with his sister Eliza's sharp sight, is Jane's extension out from the recessed, marginal, inferior place. The curtain which implicates her with the natural world is to what John Reed attaches. The tyrant who greedily gobbles mother's baked pies takes us back to the world. He is the other side of the window retreat. Here is the red burst, always threatening to break through the secret citadel. That explosion every schizoid lies over, closing eyes to, holding off, locking up. John Reed is the manifestation of the rupture from which Madame Mope continually defends. When John Reed bursts, Jane moves out of the schizoid place, more to the borders of a lived world, now of the borderlines. He wants her to show him the book, the text of the window seat terrains, and it is her calling to bring that out. When John Reed bursts through the antipathetic symbiosis within mother's unconscious, Jane is compelled to carry out the text of that unconscious. When there are not yet the words, we do not yet know a language to delineate these unconscious figures and their landscape into which we have been unconsciously placed by the stepmother. The unconscious expression becomes bodily possession, the John Reed seizure, repetitive thrusting tongue and sudden blow. He is our tantrum. He burst out from a tremendous appetite, a gorging. He is inflated, the skin everywhere bloated, the heavy limb. He is the grandiose exhibitionist. When there is the tantrum, also here is the Arctic retreat. Schizoid child beneath. Arctic retreat, covered by scarlet, attaches a grandiose craving sun which draws us out to the breakfast room. When it comes, the burst seems to come from outside ourselves, from someone despising us. Yet it extends from our isolation, which leaves itself through outburst, outing, exit, sortie. John Reed claims that Jane's book on the ice realm is really his own, that she is not alone in it, and even must emerge from her recess to return it to his world. Arctic ghosts desire a breakfast room delineation through the John Reed possession. Arctic ghosts first make their appearance in the breakfast room. Before we have learned the language of their expression or how to mediate their entry, they emerge through appetite. John gorges at the table habitually, and at school his mother sends him what in his schoolmaster's opinion is an overabundance of cakes and sweetmeats. Jane and John do not dialogue from the place in which she has been. Not dialogue, yet onslaught, cruder appetite, primary need, possession. It is his book. The rhythm of his language, a rage and greed, a grasp of what is world. In the tantrum, here is seizing, incorporating, taking back, a lashing out in order to feed, to take in, to absorb, become and have it all. His is a demand for an appetite to be satiated, and more to a bloating, craving. His text is absorbed, consumed by appetite. John Reed's relation to the borderline regions is the demand for incorporation as possession, not delineation. The text, which would configure and delineate, becomes used as a weapon. Unmediated contact precluding inscription, now covered with blood. Since the ice region in which we sit is undifferentiated from John Reed and his cruelty, it is his book and we sit in daily fear of him. His demand moves us, his energy crude of a dingy skin, heavy limb, bleared eye, flabby cheek. His lineaments are thick. His flab and inflation are our lack of differentiation. He orders her to approach and stand before him, and she does, quote, habitually obedient, end quote. The John Reed force perpetually recurs, quote, he bullied and punished me, not 2 or 3 times in the week, nor once or twice in the day, but continually. Every nerve I had feared him, and every morsel of flesh on my bones shrank when he came near, end quote. Insult followed by blows he strikes. When this force comes, we are taken by it. Quote, accustomed to John Reed's abuse, I never had an idea of replying to it. My care was how to endure the blow, which would certainly follow the insult, end quote. Repetitiously, we do what John Reed says, because of his sheer brute force, which arrives when we have sat happily too long in the ice room. Our acquiescence to him pertains to being surrounded by Iceland demons, alienated from all human relation, and too complacent in that. What then erupts is a tremendous need cutting across all human proportion and natural boundary, forcing us along. And that need is our own, as it is also that of Mrs. Reed. Now I separate from the text for a lyrical meditation. Perpetual recurrence of the same thing, repetition, compulsion. We have done what she has said to do. We live in her rule. We have left the room in her order, and this has placed us in the realm of demons, and we are happy there, since it is the only way she holds us. She sends us to the place of her utmost desolation, and then it is we must face the continual ravenous and bilious form of her hunger, her need, her unmet, unfed, now greed after us, wanting our life, wanting all that we have touched. Daily attacks of us as she is blind to it is her window seat, it is her sun. We are desperately isolated, and when he calls, we obey, habitually obedient. It is his grandiose force that demands it. And also we obey to get closer to her, only life unconscious. We obey. I'll stop here, and I'll continue chapter 1 in the next video. Thank you for listening.